All right.
Wait, is that on here?
So, just a reminder, next Sunday afternoon at 4:30, we will gather here and we will play games like Apples to Apples or anything else that people are interested in bringing. We don't have to have a precisely planned afternoon.
Do we have a shock potato?
I do not have a shock potato, but if somebody is interested in acquiring one of those, it has been a fun in the past.
It's a hilarious
Yep.
game.
And then we'll do pizza for supper, along with a few things that are slightly healthier, and then we'll shift into a regular lesson. So that'll be next Sunday at 4:30.
Yeah.
And Micaiah will definitely be communicating that. So,
Catch the taser.
all right. So we have gone through most of the intertestamental era. We're going to finish that up tonight. Next week we begin the ministry and the life of Jesus. And so we'll jump into the actual bona fide New Testament then. Then when we get into January time frame, we'll start covering the Acts of the Apostles. And in the spring, we will do a little bit of post-New Testament church history, and that will wrap up the year. But we have looked at an overview of the Old Testament, and we looked at the Apocrypha 2 weeks ago. Last weekend, we covered the Macedonian kingdoms. Tonight, we're going to look at the rise of Rome. And just a little before we get to Rome, we're going to cover the Maccabees. Now, where have you heard about the Maccabees before? First and Second Maccabees, which are in what testament? The Apocrypha, not a testament. Very good. So the Maccabees actually cover some of the fulfillment of the history of the kings of the north and the south out of Daniel 11. You remember last week we were walking through the kings of the north and the south. And as you read through Daniel 11, it sounds like it's just talking about one king and another. But as we lay out the history, it's one generation, the next generation, and every single verse is a new generation. So we get down to Daniel chapter 11, verse 21. Speaking of a king of the north, it says, "In his place shall arise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant." And this is referring to Antiochus IV, who was one of the kings of the northern kingdom. And he actually is a type of the Antichrist. So we're going to look at him just a little bit here. In the Maccabees, he's recorded and talks about what he does in Judea. He reigned from 175 to 164, so 11 years is actually not that long of a reign. But after conquering Judea, he wanted to try and Hellenize them, which means he wanted to undermine Jewish culture and replace it with Greek culture. And so, in that effort, he forbids the Jewish customs to be practiced in 168 BC, and then what really roiled everything was when he sacrificed a pig on the altar in Jerusalem. Do you remember the list of unclean animals in the book of Moses, the law of Moses? You're not even supposed to touch a pig. They're unclean. They're never used in any sacrifice. So he just really stuck it to the Jews and decided he's going to sacrifice a pig on the altar, makes the whole temple unclean, the altar unclean, and this causes a desolation of Jerusalem, actually, which is prophesied in Daniel chapter 11. Starting in verse 31, it says, "Forces from him," referring to Antiochus IV, "shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action." So Daniel prophesies this in 534 BC. And then, in 1 Maccabees, it is reported that on the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 145, and that's in the 145th year since something or other happened. It's actually in 167 BC. It says, the king erected the desolating abomination upon the altar of burnt offerings, and in the surrounding cities of Judah they built pagan altars. Does anybody know what desolating means?
To make them clean.
Say what?
To make them clean.
No.
Completely destroyed.
No.
The desolation of spot. Is it destruction?
Nope.
To make barren.
Yeah, it's emptying all the people out of the land. So all the Jews flee Jerusalem, and that is what is referred to as a desolation, is when everybody leaves, and all of a sudden there's nobody left living there. And
Desolation of spot.
yeah, so the desolation of Smog is he's no longer living, where the dwarves then take over. But that is neither here nor there. So this takes place, according to this calendar, on the 6th of December in 167 BC. And then jumping forward into the New Testament, Jesus says this in Matthew 24, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, and then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And Jesus spoke of this 200 years later, as if it was something that was not yet fulfilled. But the writer of Maccabees thought it was fulfilled. So there's an interesting thing we see in the scriptures quite regularly, is that a lot of prophecy will have a partial first fulfillment, but it has not been entirely fulfilled. And here we clearly see that with Antiochus IV desolating Jerusalem with the abomination of a sacrifice of a pig and setting up pagan images and altars. But then Jesus says this has not actually yet happened. And so you see this sometimes in the Old Testament with people who seem to foreshadow the coming Messiah. So Joshua is one of these. He is known as a type of the Messiah. Joshua means Yahweh saves, and is the same name that Jesus had. Jesus is just simply the Greek version of that name. So you have Joshua in the Old Testament, and you have Joshua in the New Testament that we know of as Jesus. And Joshua came in, conquered the promised land, delivered the Israelites from all their enemies, just like Jesus ultimately ushers us into the promised land of eternity and defeats all of our enemies. And so Joshua was a type of the Christ to come, and other people were the same. Samson was a type, David was a type, and so forth. But here we have one that is a type of the Antichrist, which is something that is the opposite of the Messiah, one who will bring desolation to Jerusalem. And Antiochus IV was a type of that to come, but he is not the full fulfillment of it. There is still yet one that we're waiting for. Did you have a question, Ellie? No. Will?
Is him sacrificing the pig on the altar like similar to the Antichrist claiming he's God in the third temple?
Maybe. When that happens, or something similar to it happens, then we'll know. Because you see, anything that's talking about the things to come is speculation.
Right.
So he sets up an image that causes desolation. No one knows what that actually is or means. Okay.
So when he slaughtered a pig on the altar,
hmm
do they then have to tear down and rebuild it, or is there a process of reconsecrating it and?
Yeah, there's a process of cleansing and reconsecrating. That happened regularly because you remember the Old Testament kings that went astray would introduce new altars and bring in idols into the temple, and then the next generation would have to cleanse the temple and throw out all the idols and then do all the purification rites and such.
Okay.
So didn't have to rebuild the temple, but you had to cleanse it. That was time consuming. Anyway, so this is an important feature that comes in, but what happens because of this desolation is there's some guys that rise up in revolt, the faithful of the Judeans at that point in time. And they were known as the Maccabees. So the first ones were led by Judas Maccabeus. Maccabeus just simply being a nickname given to him. It means the hammer, because he smashed Greek armies left and right. But he utilized a guerrilla warfare style, and so he was forerunner of terrorist organization that wanted to overthrow an army. But he actually is the first person to make diplomatic contact with Rome from the Holy Land. We'll come back around to that when we shift over to our focus in Rome. He dies in 160. By 142, his brother Simon becomes the high priest. And by this point in time, the revolt has actually gained some serious steam and leverage, and they actually gain autonomy within the Seleucid Empire. And so they're theoretically still part of the Seleucid Empire, but they are now largely independent and self-ruling.
It's like South Sudan for a while.
Kind of, yep. Kosovo in the Balkans is like that. It's part of Serbia, but then it gained its autonomy. Yeah, there's different places in the world that are autonomous, such. Anyway, I have a handout here that shows the timeline and the sequence of all of the various Maccabees. We're not going to cover every single one of them, but this will help you connect some of the highlights. In the next generation, John Hyrcanus I ends up ruling, and he ends up gaining even more autonomy. I believe it was during his reign that they were granted permission to mint their own coins, and that was essentially becoming an independent kingdom if they were able to have their own money supply in those days.
Is this all of the Maccabees?
You'll find this in the Maccabees.
Oh.
Not all of it. At this point, we might be into another historian actually, but this is under the cover of the Maccabees. For some reason, I don't know why, their kingdom that they set up is known as the Hasmonean Kingdom. I don't know the source of that name. But the Maccabees ruled independently here for quite some time. After John Hyrcanus, you have Alexander Janus who rules, and this is where we have full independence. And they actually restore the borders of Judah to the days of David and Solomon through the course of this. It took about 70-ish years to actually do it, but it was quite successful. And so they controlled Israel from Dan to Beersheba, Dan being in the north and Beersheba being the southern border and extent.
His violence here.
Yep, I know. So we're just letting him fetch that.
What's your face?
It's violin.
Ah.
This will show it on a map here.
Can you go back for 1 second?
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, going back.
Sorry.
It's all right. No, that's fine.
Guys, guess what I get to do tomorrow? I get to go to Madison.
UW Madison? Or just Madison?
Just Madison.
Okay, what's down there?
World Dairy Expo.
Oh, very fun. Alright, we good to go on to the next slide?
Yeah.
Alright, so this is the map that'll show their growing expansion here. So they start off just controlling that little pink area around Jerusalem, the various different wars of expansion. They spread out until they own everything and control everything in purple there, from the north to the south.
That's pretty much the entirety of what
David had.
David had,
Yep.
with the exception of maybe Ashkelon and like what the Philistines are.
Yep, and they were a tributary state essentially. Yes, Scout?
This might be kind of a dumb question.
No dumb questions in this class.
Where is this on like an actual like world map now? Like, where's?
It is on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea.
Okay.
So, if you look at your maps that we got last week with the Persian Empire in there, eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea, the color on this doesn't show really well, but on the left-hand side there is blue, and that's the Mediterranean Sea.
Oh yeah.
So this is right where Asia and Africa just about come together, just north of the Sinai Peninsula.
Wait,
This is Africa.
what's the significance of Jericho? Cause I know it's in like a bunch of songs.
Right here.
Yep, Jericho
Oh, yeah, 'cause
is
it's
where
over
the Israelites first conquered the promised land under Joshua.
Yeah.
So that's in the Old Testament period. Then Jesus goes through Jericho a little later.
Oh,
After Joshua, it's not too prominent of a city, but it
It
pops
gets
up in the New Testament a couple times.
built after
Yep.
some.
All right. Does anybody have any questions over the Maccabees and the independent kingdom they set up in this time frame? All right. We're going to shift into Rome, and we're going to come back to the Maccabees and see how they decline. And this is going to be the shortened, abbreviated version of Roman history because we're going to do 700 years of history in about 15 minutes.
Oh, light work.
I know, light work.
Why did you miss that?
Romulus?
Yes, Romulus. There's a legend that talks about how Rome was founded, and Romulus was an orphaned kid who gets nursed by a wolf in the legend, and he goes on to found the city of Rome, and I believe he would be the first king then. But originally Rome is ruled by kings, and it's just a city-state over on the Italian peninsula. And to put this in context, like Rome essentially starts off a village like Baldwin, and in this time frame you have the Assyrian Empire controlling the majority of the Middle East, and you've got Greek city-states that are far more powerful, and Rome is just this little cow town off in the west that gets invaded from time to time by their neighbors. Rome is ruled by 7 kings originally for about 250 years. They were elected for life, so they had a pretty good long reigning span. The historicity of that period of time is somewhat questionable, but this is as best as we know because it's the only thing that survived.
Wait, so the kings were elected, it wasn't just father son?
Nope, it wasn't a father-son. There wasn't inherited ruling. They elected a new king when one died. And to get 250 years with only 7 of them is actually kind of strange, because
Yeah.
that is a really long average.
35 to 40 years.
Yep.
King.
So they were electing young'uns when they were coming in.
Yeah.
But a major transformation takes place in 509. In 509, they overthrow the king, and they shift power to rule to the Roman Senate. And instead of having a king lead the army, they decide we're going to have 2 consuls. They'll be appointed by the Senate for 1-year terms. And the theory was, is since there's 2 of them, they have to agree if something is going to happen. Nothing will ever happen because they'll never agree on anything, which means the Senate will still retain control over everything. So this was a very new way of governing, and having only a 1-year term makes it really short term in scale. But when the Senate took over, they became very expansionary in nature. And you have Rome go from a small city-state to a massive empire in the next 500 years by 27 BC. So we're going to look at this on a map here. So it starts off, and Rome is just a little tiny red area next to the Tiber River. Tiny red area. And in the first several wars of expansion, they conquer all their neighbors, which were the Latins, and that's why they speak the language Latin, because Rome co-opted the language of their neighbors. And so they controlled a chunk of the coast of Italy. And then there's several more wars of expansions, and they picked up the orange areas and the pink areas, and in this time, there's massive superpowers all across the earth. And so, while Rome is just this small, tiny, local kingdom, you've got the kings of the north, the Seleucid dynasty there in blue, covering the majority of the Middle East from Iran all the way to Turkey. You've got the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. Down further south, you've got the kingdom of Kush. And then on the west, actually, you've got the Carthaginian Empire, because the city of Carthage, which is on the northern coast of Africa, was a major world power in those days. You have a question?
Can you point out Rome, please?
Point Rome out?
Yeah.
Let's see here. So Rome is this little tiny red zone.
Oh,
And this
okay,
is
that's what
after
I
they've
thought.
conquered a large chunk of their neighbors. They own just a little bit of the center of the peninsula. And to the north of them, they've got the Etruscans in Etruria that are ruling. And to the south of them, they've got the Samnites that are still ruling. And then you've got Greek city-states, because the Greeks were really famous at colonizing. And so they were setting up cities and kingdoms all through southern Italy and through Sicily. So there's some very large, huge world powers going on. Scythians, they're not a power as much as that is the domain that they roamed.
Oh, they're
So-
mentioned in the Scythian or.
Yeah, they're mentioned in the New Testament. Scythians were horse lords, horsemen that lived on the plains of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. And they had cavalry, and they were really dangerous, but there were not very many of them concentrated because they were spread out across the grasslands and such.
Do we still have cavalry?
In 2001, when the United States invaded Afghanistan, we used donkeys. It wasn't quite horses, but we went in on horses. Genetically modified horses, there you go. Mules, donkeys, horses, so that we could get through the hills of Afghanistan.
So do we still have cavalry?
No, we co-opted them from a bunch of local Afghanis. We don't have any horses in the military today, in the US military. I imagine somewhere in the world somewhere there does, but we do use them when the terrain requires it. Yep. Alright, so 300 BC, Rome is still a really tiny kingdom, and this is kind of amusing in the context of Daniel's prophecies, because you remember Rome is that kingdom that is the kingdom of iron, and it crushes every kingdom around it. And so it doesn't look like it at this point in time, even after half of the prophecies have come to pass.
It's looking like this loses the Carthaginian Empire, so they're gonna be that iron.
Yep, either one of those looks like it'd be more powerful, but neither one lasts through Rome. So eventually Rome takes over all of the Italian peninsula there in pink, and they also pick up Corsica, Sardinia, and a fair chunk of Sicily. There's a city-state of Syracuse in the green zone there on the southern part of Sicily, and they're kind of a client state of Rome, so they're allied and connected to Rome, but not officially ruled by Rome.
Sued for peace.
And at this point, you've only got two major powers in the Western Mediterranean. You've got Rome and you've got Carthage. And they went at each other through 3 wars over the course of 150 years, and Rome got the upper hand and took out the Carthaginian Empire. And so, at that point, then Rome has everything in the Western Mediterranean, and then they can turn and look to the east, and they start picking off some of the surviving kingdoms of the Macedonians and the Greeks. So they conquer Greece, Macedonia, and they start picking up parts of what is now modern-day Turkey and Asia there. And they are on an expansionary bent that is now unchecked, because they don't have anybody in the Western Mediterranean that holds a candle to them, and they can just simply march east as far as their armies can be victorious. And through a large number of complicated wars, they end up picking up everything that is over here, with the exception of Parthia. So, about 150 BC, 100 BC is this time frame here. They have everything that is red and pink, and next they pick up everything that's green, and then they start marching down towards where the Maccabees are ruling, the Hasmonean kingdom there in Israel. That's the dark blue in the center lower part of that map.
So at what point of their conquest did the Maccabees first send a letter to Rome?
They sent a letter to Rome back a ways. Before Rome had taken on Macedonia and Asia, it was still largely green. That would have been about the time frame.
Okay.
So that was a friendly envoy.
Yeah.
So
So that was before, after they took out Carthage. So they were definitely.
yep, it was after Carthage was overtaken.
Okay.
But they hadn't taken on Greece or anybody like that. So it'd kind of be like Brazil sending a friendly message to Australia, because they're both in the same world, but they're not endangering or threatening each other. So you can have a good diplomatic connection there because you're not a threat to either one. So then the world looks like this, and we're going to see how they end up taking over Judea. And this is complicated, but this brings an end to the Maccabees' self-rule. So let's see, which one of these guys dies? Alexander Janus dies, and Hyrcanus II takes over after him. And he's supported by the Pharisees, but he has a rival, Aristobulus, who is supported by the Sadducees. And Pharisees and Sadducees are going to be prominent characters in the New Testament, especially the Pharisees. They were essentially rival political parties 200 years earlier, but rival and not very civil. So like Democrats and Republicans today don't seem very civil, but as a rule of thumb, most years none of them die or kill the other.
So it's
And-
like the Civil War counterpart, pretty much?
Kind of, yeah. So in their day, if you were going to take on the Sadducees, a lot of them would end up dead by the end of the day. And so they fought back and forth, and it was much like the American Civil War, where you had the South who wanted to rule America one way and the North who wanted to rule America the different way, and they fought back and forth. And so there was a civil war that went on here for a while between the two sons of Alexander Janus. Civil wars tend to weaken kingdoms, and that is precisely what happened here. So Aristobulus gets on the throne during the Civil War and rules from 66 to 63. And that entices Hyrcanus to invite Pompey, one of the most significant Roman generals at that time, to come in and help get him back on the throne. So Pompey and his Roman army marched down into Judea and put Hyrcanus II back on the throne in Jerusalem. And at this point, Hyrcanus II is very much the client of the Romans. He's only there because Rome put him back in charge. And so this is the point at which Roman influence over Judea becomes preeminent, and it's no longer really an independent kingdom. So things get complicated in 40 BC. There was a guy by the name of Antipater, and he was an Idumean, which in the Old Testament would be known as an Edomite. Anybody who was there from the Old Testament survey remember who the Edomites were relative to the Israelites? Esau's descendants. So Isaac has two sons, they're twins, Jacob and Esau. Jacob later gets renamed Israel. He has the Israelites and the Jews as his descendants. Esau has the Edomites as his descendants. And in the New Testament, they're known as Idumeans. So Antipater is an Idumean, and he becomes really influential in the Roman court, or in the court of Hyrcanus II, and he's aligned with the Romans, and he is actually the father of Herod the Great. He dies in 43 BC, just before everything comes apart. And what precipitates everything coming apart is the Parthians. So the Parthian Empire is what conquered the eastern wing of the Seleucid Empire. And they are the predecessors of Iran today. And they were the successors of Persia. So the Parthians invade Syria and Judea. Hyrcanus gets exiled to Babylon, and so he ends up heading over east. Antigonus is given the high priesthood in Judea, and he becomes a Parthian client king for 3 years. And this is when Herod the Great seizes the opportunity and makes his rise. Herod the Great is the Herod of the Jesus story when he's born. So we're getting really close to the birth of Jesus here.
Can you go back for one more second?
Okay, we can go back for one more second. Antigonus is given the high priesthood by the Parthians. Okay. So Herod the Great flees to Rome when the Parthians invade. Remember, he's the son of Antipater, so he's an Idumean as well. And when he's in Rome, they appoint him king of Judea, which is all fine and dandy. They don't control Judea. So the Romans just are supporting him in his cause. They appoint him to be the king of Judea. Now go conquer it. And so Herod the Great raises an army. It's a Roman army. It's not a local army. That's not Jews. It's not Idumeans. They just give him a couple Roman legions, or maybe 3 or 4. I'm not even sure how many. Because the Romans have a vested interest in taking out the Parthians, and then Herod can locally rule Judea, and they don't have to be in the middle of dealing with that. So he conquers Galilee and Judea over a period of 3 years. He lays siege to Jerusalem in 37 BC, and when they get Jerusalem, Antigonus, the high priest that was appointed by the Parthians, gets beheaded by the Romans, and then Herod becomes king of Judea. And he's a client of Rome. Kind of like, I'm trying to figure out how you'd explain that. Belarus is a client nation under Russia, and let's see, a lot of Americans like to think of Canada as our client state, but the Canadians don't take to that very well, so I won't describe
How
them
about
that
like
way.
Ireland?
No, no.
Great
Scotland and Great Britain, maybe. Yeah,
Australia,
Aus-
Great Britain, like half
sort
a
of.
century ago.
The Aussies don't like that description. Of course, the Belarusians don't like it either. But in any case, Judea is ruled by Herod. They're nominally independent of Rome, but they only have power because of Rome. And so, as long as Rome is in good shape, they're in good shape, and they have to keep Rome in its good graces, though, too. Now, for a little while here, Rome is going through its own civil wars. And this is how Rome transitions from a senate into a republic into an empire.
I have the connection. It's the Afghani government that we set up in Afghanistan.
There you go. When we invade Afghanistan, we overthrow the Taliban, we put an Afghanistan government in power. It's really American power. It's just got local guys, in theory, in charge of it. So there you go. Thank you, Kyle. That is the nature of a client state. So Herod has all kinds of Roman soldiers around making sure he stays in charge. Meanwhile, the Roman Republic is going through civil war after civil war. And this is more drama than I can fully explain. You've got the triumvirates, where you got 3 generals that will align together for a little while until one of them wants to overthrow the other 2. And the final war ends up being between Mark Antony and Octavius Caesar. Mark Antony and Cleopatra align down in Egypt. Cleopatra is the last of the Ptolemies, and so her kingdom loses its independence at this point in time when Octavius Caesar defeats the fleet in 31 BC at Actium. And then Octavius is declared the Pharaoh of Egypt, which is pretty good because he's a Roman. And so he just adds that into his Roman holdings. 27 BC, Octavius Caesar gets declared Augustus, which becomes the title of the Caesar. Funny thing is, the Caesar is just his last name, actually, but we know that as Kaiser or Tsar or Caesar today. And he's declared the first emperor or imperator. And the empire at first still holds on to all of its forms. They still have a senate. The senate still thinks it has power. But the emperor of the Roman Empire very much is the one pulling the strings and holding the imperial power. And so Octavius Caesar becomes Augustus Caesar, and he is mentioned in the birth of Jesus story as well. So as we start into the New Testament next week, the map looks like this. All the yellow area is what Rome occupied going into the imperial period, and they pick up all the dark green areas and the pink areas in the next 30 years. And so when Jesus is born, they control everything around the entire Mediterranean Sea, most of Western Europe, all of Asia Minor or Turkey, a good chunk of the perimeter of the Black Sea. The only little thing that they don't control directly is where Herod the Great is king down here in Judea. This little light green area is his kingdom. He's a Roman client, but he is reigning independently.
They didn't really care about titles.
Yeah, the Romans weren't really concerned about that because he was aligned with them. So,
Did the taxes go to Herod? or-
yep, taxes would go to Herod.
But they were organized through Caesar, Augustus, because he would have declared
Yep,
census.
he was the one declaring the census. But
What's
Herod
the
was the one.
census?
That's when you count up how many people are living everywhere.
Oh.
Wait, Caesar declared the census?
Yep, Caesar declared the census. So this is a fuzzy zone because the Romans are treating Judea as if it's their own kingdom, but it technically isn't their kingdom. Herod the Great is officially in charge, but he's only in charge because the Romans put him in charge and his soldiers enforce it. So it's really a fuzzy gray zone. But it has significance, as we're going to find out in the story of Jesus' birth next week, but I'm going to leave that for next week. So Rome, over the course of 750 years, went from a small Baldwin-sized cow town to a global superpower that controls most of the known world in the West.
A lot can happen in 700 years.
Yeah, a lot can happen in 750 years.
This is gonna be a really stupid question, but nobody actually.
No, it's
ever
not a
explained
stupid
it to
question.
me. Why is Jesus called Jesus of Nazareth?
Nazareth
Where he
is
grew
his
up?
hometown. That's where he grew up.
So that's where, like, Joseph and Mary left
Yep.
from.
Joseph and
Go
Mary
to,
lived in Nazareth, and they
Um,
left and went down to Bethlehem,
Yeah, and then
and
came
they
back.
go back to Nazareth, and that's where Jesus grows up and spends
Okay.
a good 30 years, 33 years of his life.
He learned how to
That makes
talk.
way
So
more
that's
sense.
why he's Jesus of Nazareth. What, Mackay?
That's where he learned how to talk mostly.
Yep. He was a Galilean in the small town of Nazareth.
That could have been better. You have my highlighter.
All right. Any other questions? There are not stupid questions.
Nobody ever actually explained that to me, and it's kind of sad.
You know, that's why we have this class, so that you can ask questions that nobody's ever explained.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
all right, that will do.